I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm Clare Hayes-Brady. You are here. It's conversation time. Shall we discuss Byzantine Erotica? It's the Great Concavity.
We shall discuss it.
I don't actually know a lot about Byzantine Erotica. I mean, I love a racy mosaic, but you know.
You're a sucker for a racy mosaic.
I can't resist them. It's the tiles, you know. It's I'm a tactile person. So.
Tactile, yeah. That takes on a new meaning.
What's funny is if you Google Byzantine Erotica, the first 10 results are all about infinite jest.
Oh, that's comforting, I suppose.
Yeah, a little upsetting though. I mean, surely there's a rich history in Byzantine Erotica. I would think.
And Wallace has just usurped all of that in one fell swoop.
He's getting in the way.
I think he actually gets the time frame of it wrong, though, and that it's not Byzantine Erotica. It's like Pompeii has a lot of erotic.
Oh, yeah.
So it's one of those errors in the book.
Yeah, and there are so many, and it's always I always wondered this whether to take them as errors or as intentional errors, and it's always hard to tell. I think, but it's one of the most interesting things, and his spelling of Quebecois is one that always confused me because I think he spells it wrong.
Quebecois, that actual word?
Yeah, I think he spells it wrong pretty persistently. There are two ways of spelling it, and he doesn't use either of them. So. Yeah, and again, I don't know. My Quebecois isn't particularly strong, oddly.
Mine neither.
so I don't know. The error thing is I think really interesting.
Yeah.
So we're speaking here today with Clare Hayes-Brady. Let's back up and get into a little bit of introduction. Clare is a scholar at Trinity College in Dublin.
University College Dublin now. So I've gone to the dark side.
UCD, not TCD.
Yeah, that's right. I still have a TCD address. I'm still around there. So.
Oh yeah.
So you did your PhD at
TCD. Yeah, I did my undergrad and my PhD, and actually I went to play school in Trinity. My parents teach there, so I was in Trinity my whole life. And I left a couple of years ago, and I've gone over to UCD, which in Dublin is a big change.
Oh yeah, you changed
playing
teams,
for the other
essentially.
team, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and Dublin has become kind of a hotbed of Wallace studies.
It has.
Yeah, I was
it's
just
great.
thinking that this morning too. So you got Adam Kelly,
there's a few of us.
Yourself, Tim
Adam, Tim, Tom, Tracy is here too.
Philip Coleman.
Philip is here as well. Of course, Philip supervised Tim and myself during our PhDs. So it's a funny thing. There's a little enclave here, and we all get really excited when we see each other.
Which is once a week, right? You guys have a weekly Wallace meeting. I mean, obviously.
Adam's gone to Yorick, which is very sad. So we miss him. But yeah, we see each other fairly regularly. It's really nice, actually.
Rad.
And
that's great.
You're also the author of a book that just came out this year. I guess it came out earlier in 2016.
That's right.
Was it June, May or June?
No, it came out in February. It was a while ago. Yeah. Came out in February, and has been we launched it in April, right before I had my daughter.
It's been a busy year for you. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Very cool.
So yeah, I'm delighted with the book, obviously, and it's again there's a real kind of seeing Dave's book come out in the last couple of weeks and everything. There's some really exciting stuff happening at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. So your book is called The Unspeakable Failures of David Foster Wallace, Language, Identity, and Resistance.
Yes.
A very provocative title, I might say,
I thought
Claire.
I would get some trouble for that.
I had a sneaking suspicion that it was... So the title was trying to hook the reader in a compelling way, which it does.
A little.
But that failure might have sort of an alternate sort of... definition or subtext, and my suspicions were confirmed in your introduction that you're not necessarily saying that Wallace is a failed writer in a total way, but there are elements of his work that are highly geared towards types of failure.
Yes, I think it's sort of twofold. I mean, I think that there are there are elements of Wallace's work that do fail, absolutely, that
sure.
are
yeah,
like
you definitely
outline
that.
Like any writer, of course, and I think that's a really interesting area of any writer's work to study. But also, I'm interested in the concept of failure, which he and the lack of completion, which he comes to, I think, again and again, right from the start. And I'm really I very much see Wallace's work as quite coherent, kind of beginning to end. I really see a thread from the start, and it very much is to do with non-completion, with lack of closure, and often with failure, I think. So that's where it came from. But yeah, it's a total clickbait of a title. It definitely is.
Well, and it is an analog book, but it's clickbait.
Yeah, definitely.
It kind of mirrors, Wallace's supposed title or subtitle of Infinite Jest,
absolutely.
Which was a failed entertainment.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I think so.
And so he was aware of, I think it's wrapped up with what the reasons why people would read a book of that size.
Yeah, absolutely.
And can you speak to that a little bit, because your book covers a lot of ground. It's really about 7 chapters of a little bit of fiction, nonfiction, philosophy, gender, identity, all kinds of themes that you cover in the book. So
I have difficulty focusing.
Oh, no. I think, can you give us just a little bit of an overview of how the book came to be and what your sort of organizing principle was there?
Yeah, to go back into the mists of time, the book emerged sort of from my PhD work, which I began as it happened 2 weeks exactly after Wallace died. I was all set to begin. I had done my undergraduate dissertation on his short fiction, and then taken a year out of college. And I was all set to kick off September 2008, and then of course he died. And I started doing the work, but the timing of it, obviously, for that reason, was quite interesting. So over my PhD took 3 years, and then it took a while to get the book together. But obviously, over that time, the scholarship mushroomed and changed really radically. Yeah. So the book actually bears very little relationship to the work that I did for the PhD. The only chapter that's kind of more or less unchanged is, I think, chapter 4, which is the kind of basic philosophy chapter. Pretty much everything else was new. So where the book basically came from was that basis, that theoretical basis of my PhD, but then conversations with other scholars. And it was just such a rich time to be working on Wallace, such an exciting time, and Matt, you were involved in Consider David Foster Wallace. That conference back in 2009 was just this unbelievably exciting and rich discussion. Like, we'd all sort of found each other and just got really, really excited over in Liverpool for a couple of days, and I don't think anybody slept very much. So a lot of it is based on those kinds of conversations, and I had to go back and really radically revisit all of the work that I had done just to keep up with the development of the field, which was really exciting. Where it basically came from was, or the sort of organizing principle that you asked for, was this idea that there are no endings that I could find in Wallace's work. And I'm interested in short story theory. Of course, short fiction is something where the concept of a beginning, middle, and end just doesn't make a lot of sense in the way that it does for the sort of traditional structure of the novel. And I'm probably, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, I'm probably the only real Wallace scholar who doesn't totally love Infinite Jest. Sorry. I'll just hang up now, shall I?
Thanks for listening, everyone, to episode 21. That's a wrap.
It's not what I send people to, people who come and sort of say, what should I read? It just isn't what I send them to begin with. I send them to the short fiction, because I think that there's an awful lot of just extraordinary work there that is not so much overlooked exactly as it's so delicate that you can almost miss it. And I think that resistance to closure comes across very strongly in the short fiction. So I was interested in exploring that a little more. And out of that, the concept of failure and silence and incompleteness just sort of kept reasserting itself. It wasn't part of my PhD work at all, but as I went back, I kept realizing that it was change the conversation, keep the conversation going, never quite reaching an end. And where endings are represented, they are very often, I think, represented in conjunction with death. That there is a sense that an ending in itself is a kind of failure, or a kind of a completion that stops a conversation that Wallace very much wanted to keep going, which is an extraordinarily rambly way of saying I'm interested in the fact that he never finished anything, it seems to me.
I think that's fair, and I think it goes kind of with what he said about the structure of Infinite Jest in general, which is that is a fractured narrative because that better resembles his real life.
Yeah. And I think that idea of realism, when you talk about Wallace and realism, and he did talk about that this is the texture of the world I live in, and we don't have neat narratives. And looking at the kind of philosophers that I see reflected in his work, Ricoeur and Rorty in particular. Obviously, we talk a lot about Wittgenstein, but I mean, Rorty's whole philosophical project was to keep the conversation going. And similarly, Ricoeur talks about narrative as a way of putting order on otherwise inchoate experiences. And I think that Wallace maybe took that idea and sort of said, well, that doesn't really work. You can try and order a narrative, but it doesn't really reflect reality then. So how, as a writer, can I begin to reflect the reality that I live in? And so you end up with a novel that ends before it begins, which is, I think, the definition of not finishing.
And he also just said he was really bad at writing endings.
Sure.
And, you also got to think one of the first stories he wrote was Planet Trilithon, which ends without a word, like in the middle of a sentence.
As does Broom,
As does Broom, right?
Same with Broom.
So to me, that's also like a reflection of like a 24-year-old writer in 1985 who's trying to be clever.
Yeah.
And it uses some kind of philosophical argument to back up the fact, that he's just trying to do something different, and he wants to be talked about, like, oh, that was edgy, when you're 24, and and it's postmodernism is sort of at its peak in this point, right?
Sure.
And he's reading other kind of structurally interesting stuff. And it's really not that interesting. Like, oh, you stopped in the middle of a sentence.
I mean, in Broom, what's even more annoying is the word that's left out is word.
Right.
Like, you're just looking at it going, oh, come on.
like it's a little too cute.
Quite on the nose, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's it's interesting to think that he was sort of using philosophy to back up what was ultimately perhaps just a kind of a trick.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I also think, there's something else going on there, which is that he does, like you say, have trouble with this idea of closure in general.
Yeah.
And that, in stories and in life, how can you really be done with something?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think Oblivion as a collection is something that always comes to mind, at good old Neon particularly. To literally not let death even be the end. Death is not the end.
Right.
And then not another word, and he kind of this idea of silence, of the ending of something as really frightening and awful. Suicide is a sort of present as well in brief interviews. That idea of death as a kind of completion. I think so. So endings and death seem to be very closely tied together to me.
I think that's fair. And I mean, it leads me to wonder what you don't like about Infinite Jest, because it has this, this piece of a wraith and kind of a reader hostile ending where it is, for a lot of people, deeply just sad to get to the end of it. And, just to even finish the book is a type of ending.
Yeah.
And yet he, I think, does try to lead the reader back to the beginning of the book,
right?
So that his way in, that there's a sort of this like authorial statement there that what's driving you back is this pleasure in the text itself.
Yeah, and it is the kind of book that I think you can get to the end and just turn over and start again.
But if that's a failure for you, maybe talk about that.
Sure. It's not that I don't love Infinite Jest. I do. And every time I read it, I find something new in it. Of course, like I think everybody, it's more that it's such a forbidding book in some ways, even just visually. Didn't fit in my handbag, actually, to be honest. That was one of my big problems with it. Carrying it around was a nightmare. I did actually have, and again, I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, I have a couple of copies of Infinite Jest, and the first one I had, which was a paperback, I tore in half.
I thought about doing that too.
I did it, and I hate doing that. I'm not someone who damages books, but I really had to do it. So partly it's just the sheer size of it is so forbidding for people who are kind of just coming to Wallace. So I think it's that it's so clearly a masterpiece and so clearly the center of a career that I'm not that interested in it. I'm interested in the peripheral stuff. Yeah, and I think that getting into Wallace, it's maybe easier through the short fiction, but also I read Broom first. That was the first Wallace work that I read, and I think I have this theory that the work that you read first is the one you always come back to with Wallace. And I think most people read Jest first. So I'm just being contrarian, really, I think.
Well, it's funny because DT Max says the same thing. Yeah. And there are, you're not alone in this contrarian streak,
Good.
I guess.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
Another.
So really, you're just a conformist, Claire.
Yeah,
is what
totally,
Matt's saying.
totally. I'm the ultimate hipster.
You can't be a rebel. No. I think and this kind of leads me to another thing that you talk about in the book, which is some people see, even writing a book that long as being, you have to be really narcissistic.
Sure.
Or you have to be sort of self-involved to the point where just hoping other people will like your story is not enough. You're sort of telling them something else. So I'm curious, talk about narcissism and solipsism for a little bit, because I think that some scholars have interpreted Wallace's reflections on that a little differently than others.
Yeah.
How do you see that as a theme in his overall work?
I think it's narcissism and solipsism are obviously they're unavoidable in Wallace, but I think Mary Holland makes the point in one of her really great essays that the narcissism you see in Wallace is infantile narcissism. It's not the kind of, or to me anyway, it's not the kind of narcissism that we condemn in society as being sort of self-obsessed. It's the kind of narcissism of an infant that actually can't see beyond their own boundaries. It's not nothing else in the world is important. It's there's nothing else in the world. So that there's an urgency to it. I always feel, which differentiates it a little bit from the kind of irritating narcissism of some other writers, perhaps. And I guess you do have to be narcissistic probably to write something that big and ambitious and encyclopedic, and ask people to read it. But to undertake the project in the first place, never mind asking people to read it, is such a huge thing to do, that I think I don't know of another word for it. I guess narcissism is the word for it, but it's not necessarily selfish. It's self-reflective and self-absorbed in a way, but I don't think it's selfish necessarily. And I'm not even to sort of make a distinction there that it's, you are offering something, as he as an author, he was offering something for consumption rather than just rather than ordering, I suppose, people to read. So I don't know. It's a difficult distinction to make, I think. And he talks about it, of course, in the McCaffrey interview, but just prior to Jeff's publication, this sense of simultaneously giving and taking. And Adam Kelly talks a lot about that and the idea of the transactional gift, when he's talking about the idea of new sincerity. So I think it's his writing is narcissistic, but writing in general is narcissistic, I think.
So with the narcissism thing, I think that a lot of readers at first glance don't see that because they get a really empathetic connection with the reader. Yes. And, Wallace does have this intention in his artwork to say, what is the art's heart purpose?
Right.
And is it really to try to connect with readers? And I think that he does that extremely well, or he wouldn't have the kind of following that he does. So how do you manage that kind of contradiction?
Yeah, well, I think so to go back a little bit to the question of what kind of narcissism we're talking about, I think that's where that distinction comes into play, because when we talk about narcissism and we talk about toxic narcissism, and it's this real buzzword at the moment, I think, and you have all these articles, do you love a narcissist and all this kind of stuff. And what we're talking about is selfishness in some way. And it seems to me that the kind of narcissism that Wallace interrogated and also, I think, engaged in is this sort of infantile narcissism whose whole purpose actually is trying to get outside of itself. That if you watch, as we were talking earlier about, sort of recently having kids and so on, and I think if you look at the way an infant communicates, it's not really able to see beyond its own needs, and yet its primary drive, without speech, without awareness, without any kind of anything, is to move beyond itself, is to communicate. And it seems to me that it's that kind of almost incoherent need to communicate that I see as the narcissism Wallace is talking about. And that is not a selfish thing. That is absolutely empathic and asking for empathy, I think. And I would distinguish, I think, between narcissism and solipsism. And we do tend to use the terms interchangeably. And I mean, solipsism is the idea that there is nothing, that everything in the universe is a projection of your own mind. So there's no need to communicate. If you're a solipsist, there's no need to communicate because there's nothing outside yourself. Whereas if you're talking about that kind of infantile narcissism, the whole purpose of everything you do is to get outside of that. And I think that distinction is important, and it's one that maybe we don't always articulate.
I think that's really interesting because it sounds like immediately is just a flaw. And I think it relates to some other, flaws that you bring up in the book. Especially you deal a lot with love. Yeah. And you're talking about romantic relationships and
which are always failed or
they're just bad. It's awful.
Well, and that goes back to something I've said on the podcast before, and I think that's just a fiction writer's responsibility, is like, when is happiness and love ever made for good fiction?
Yeah, true.
And that like, well, things went swimmingly and we just loved each other so much. And it's like, well, that's not dramatic.
And it's an awfully boring story.
Right. And so, Wallace's, what do you find problematic, I guess, with his portrayal of romantic relationships?
I guess you're absolutely right that, fiction at the end of the day is an art form, and happiness is terrible art as a general rule. Your sort of Hallmark and that lady that photographs babies in flowers and, those kinds of...
Anne Geddes.
Yes. There's, these kind of happiness in art tends to be pretty nauseating, I think. So I guess it's inescapable that we're going to be talking about failed relationships. And I suppose even in real life, most relationships do fail. I guess it's the brutality of the kind of the unromantic relationships that I see in Wallace that I find sometimes just draining, just sort of hard to read. And even, there are very few background relationships that are successful. Even if you're talking about a protagonist's family or, kind of peripheral characters, there are very few images even of successful relationships. And for a writer who is obsessed with love, I think, in a number of ways, romantic, sexual, platonic, and sort of social love, almost in that empathy question, it's just that it strikes me very strongly that Wallace didn't write about successful relationships really at all. Not that they should necessarily be the focus of anything, and not that he should have. It just strikes me that he didn't.
Well, and what I found kind of distasteful is that after his death, Jonathan Franzen sort of pinged him for this as well.
Yeah.
And said, well, Dave was depressed as evidence of that, sort of he couldn't really write about love, or he was unable to really portray any sort of normal romantic relationships, as if Jonathan Franzen is the world's arbiter of great romantic writing.
Wasn't he nominated for one of those Bad Sex Awards a couple of years ago? I'm pretty sure he was. I don't think he won it even, but I'm pretty sure he was nominated for one.
Which, to me, I mean, in a way, it felt validating as saying, well, thank God he didn't write some, happy coming of age story.
Yeah, absolutely.
That made Jonathan Franzen really like, wow, that really taught me about love.
Yeah, that would have been depressing in its own way, I think.
I think one of the things a lot of scholars cite as, kind of misogynistic or really misogynistic is Brief Interviews with Hideous Men.
Yeah.
And yet I see that in a different sort of light, in that he's not really triumphant there, is he?
No,
God, he's sort of saying like, this is
awful. Men. I mean, clues in the title, guys. Like, no, I don't see it as triumphant at all. And I know in one of the Bookworm interviews, he talks about the kind of misogyny that he's writing there as coming from a place of real fear. And fear is the term that he uses, that these are men who are afraid of women. Which I thought was really interesting, and I think is a motivating element in Brief Interviews. I mean, I think Brief Interviews is an astonishing piece of work. Very hard to read sometimes, particularly as a woman. It's quite hard to read some of it. But Wallace himself may or may not have been misogynistic. I don't know. I didn't know him. But I think as a writer, he investigates misogyny in really interesting ways. And one of the ways that he does that is through these abortive or failed or sort of miserable sexual relationships. But that doesn't mean, and to go back to Franzen, I don't necessarily think that he absolutely couldn't have written about a successful relationship. But as you say, that's not that interesting necessarily, and it's not germane to what he was investigating. And I think that if we look at love as a broader concept in Wallace, there's an awful lot of it there. It may not manifest itself in relationships, which is interesting in itself, I think. But love is a hugely important idea to him.
And you deal, I think, pretty well with that concept in the Brief Interview number 20, the Granola Cruncher story, which is really about a brutal rape. But you know what, I want to get your thoughts on that a little more, because I think that's one of his most underappreciated pieces, not only for what it does in the story itself and the power of the language, but really as a metaphor for writing and building empathy between the reader.
That's interesting.
And that his character there has to create empathy with a rapist in order to survive. Yeah. And that's a sort of extreme case, but I think that he put a lot of pressure on himself to connect with readers.
Yes.
And saw it as life or death for him, and that when his art was connecting and working well, he felt alive and in control.
And escaping death, almost, not just alive, but sort of surviving, I think.
Exactly. And for readers who don't have your book yet, tell a little bit about the chapter where you investigate that story.
Yeah, so this was sort of playing around for a while. It's been a sort of a long-standing. It's like you, I think it's one of the more underappreciated stories. I think it's one of the best stories, and I think it's extraordinarily rich. There's an awful lot going on. It's a hard story to read again, and it is a brutal piece of work. But you have the first layer, and you hear this guy telling the story about how he came to fall in love with somebody. And there's a really interesting balancing act, I think, in the sense that you get the sense, or I get the sense as a reader, that the narrator really believes that he's in love with this woman. You know, he's not kidding. He really thinks that he's fallen in love with this Granola Cruncher, which is what he calls her. We never get her name. She's never given a name. Neither is he. And yet then towards the end, it devolves into this extremely hostile, this rant at the interviewer, which is extremely misogynistic. And makes no bones about it. And what sort of interests me is how you can have that simultaneous love-hate relationship that Wallace himself talked about in making art. I find Brief Interview hugely unromantic. I think that it's.
I'd say that's pretty fair.
Yeah, I think even the love story is a kind of an appropriation. So he is telling this woman's story as though it were his own. Almost, he's appropriated her narrative, in which she has empathized with a rapist and murderer to the point where not only does he not rape her, or he does, but he's robbed of the rapist's power, which is very problematic, I think, in its own way, because the idea that by empathizing with a rapist you could turn a rape into not a rape is enormously problematic.
Sure. It's pretty naive.
Right? Yeah, I think so. And yet, it's a powerful idea in the story, the idea of robbing an agent of agency. And so this guy then takes this story and relates it to somebody else. So he's silencing her in another way. And he again, as I said, we don't get her name. He gives her an epithet. He gives her a nickname instead of an identity. And yet, so you have this kind of absolute terrible misogyny, or it seems that you have this terrible misogyny going on at two levels. So you have the rapist and murderer who ultimately goes off and kills himself, we think, and then you have this guy who is belittling to an extent the story of this woman, but her language comes through the story all the way. Her language is what takes him over. And in the end, he devolves into this ranting kind of maniac because he's not able to take ownership of her story. So in a sense, and I don't want to overstate this, but in a sense, I think that the silent feminine that we encounter so much in Wallace has a power of its own that he didn't maybe quite get to grips with. And in a sense, this is going to sound possibly a little odd, but it's something I talk about quite a lot in the book, that in a sense, the silencing of female characters is a representation of the unwillingness to appropriate a voice on Wallace's part, that he doesn't do what his character in Brief Interview 20 does. He doesn't say, well, I will tell this woman's story. And I think that in light of maybe recent discussions, I don't know if you saw Lionel Shriver's. Yes. So I don't know if that's good or bad. But I think
it's a double bind, I think, for Wallace. That if he does write from the perspective of a woman, which he did for his first novel, then he is going to be criticized as saying, well, you don't really understand women, and you can't really write authentically from the point of view of a woman. And then if you don't write from the point of view of a woman, it's like, well no, you didn't even try.
Yeah, you haven't stepped out. And I think, this is something we see with race and ethnicity as well. And I mean, the story that comes to mind there is Solomon Silverfish, which just, oh God, I mean, so he writes in the kind of, in this vernacular, and it's so terrible. And then even worse, there's this Too Pretty character, and he writes in a kind of a black sort of vernacular as well. And it's just, it's tearingly obvious and clunky, but at one level, I think at least he tried. And so it's, and yet, again, that we come back to this idea of failure, and it's a double bind that I think all writers probably face. But Wallace was very open about it.
You say that,
I think that's good.
You say that Wallace's masculinity occupies rather than converses.
Yeah.
And this seems to sort of fit that idea.
I think so, that he not Wallace himself, and again, I didn't know him, and I'm hesitant to ascribe those kinds of motivations, but a lot of his characters, instead of engaging in dialogue, they appropriate stories. So and that's sort of what I mean by occupy rather than converse. And again, Brief Interview 20 is a prime example of it, but it doesn't work for most of them. And you see the sort of the narrative of the female characters very often coming through sort of despite the best efforts of the male protagonists to quash them and to resist that and to assume power. Certainly there are different kinds of power at play in the writing. And I talk a little bit in the book about the myth of Philomela, who is she was a Greek mythological character who suffered a rape and whose tongue was cut out by her rapist to prevent her from telling the story. Yeah. And so she wove a tapestry that showed it happening to sort of indict her accuser, and was turned into a nightingale. Then it's Ovid's Metamorphoses, I think, which fairly sure Wallace was familiar with, and certainly Barth used a lot in Lost in the Funhouse. So I think there's quite a long history there, and I think there's a connection with Philomela, perhaps. And that idea of using different forms of language to represent female experience, to represent the experience of the other. So I think when we accuse Wallace of misogyny, I don't necessarily think that we're wrong. I just think it's maybe not that simple.
Well, and I think, as a white male, I can speak for myself as a white male. I think that maybe the most feminist thing you can do is to write from a female's perspective without explicitly making it about femininity.
Yes.
But rather making it about the human condition,
yes.
Which I think Wallace sincerely tried to do with multiple characters.
Yeah.
Right.
Madam Psychosis, you talk a little bit about Tony Ware in The Pale King. Mm-hmm. So there are some characters who would complicate any sort of grand thesis of gender in his work. But
I think that you're right. I mean, I think even going right back to the beginning, if you look at Lenore, there's a lot going on with Lenore that is not about her femininity. It's not about her gender at all.
Right. And as you say that she's a poorly disguised avatar of Wallace.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe that's why she doesn't seem very feminine.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, and I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. That a feminist action on the part of a male writer is to write a female character who's not just a female character. And it may not work, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try it. And I'm sure you are familiar with the recent Amy Hungerford's thing that happened.
Yeah, that's been.
And I think I was reading it. I don't think she's totally wrong, but I think that she misses the point. That for a writer to try and fail is probably better than to not try at all. And I mean, Wallace was so bound by his own white masculinity, and it's so clear that he's really conscious of it the whole way through his career, that to attempt to step beyond that was always going to be hugely fraught for him. And yet he attempted and didn't shy away from it. Didn't necessarily work.
Well, and I think that it does speak to the fear or the problem of being a white male. Fan of David Foster Wallace. Sure. And I talk about this in my own perspective all the time because I hate it, because I think it's an unfair stereotype that part of what disproves it is that we're talking to you here today who is a female scholar of David Foster Wallace. And in my experience, there are plenty of them to kind of disprove or back up or just represent in the scholarship, even more so than some other, say, Joyce scholars. Yeah, Joyce, I think, is still very much a boys' club. But even there, you have. I'm speaking in Dublin. Our library is the James Joyce Library. Sorry about that.
That's
Dublin.
Okay. But I mean, I think that there are a lot of really, really interesting female critics working on Wallace, and also not necessarily working on Wallace and gender, just reading Wallace and criticizing Wallace's readers. And I think, there's a sense in which I think the majority of Wallace's readers probably are male. I don't know. But
you say that there's a heavy bias towards the Y chromosome in his fan base.
I think I just like that.
Yeah, we've been talking about that a fair bit throughout some of these episodes, and sort of reevaluating if that landscape has changed.
I think
I seem to get the impression that it is.
Yeah, I think it's changing. Some of the students that I teach, some of the ones that read Wallace most astutely are my female students. I think it's easy to read a writer who speaks your language. It's easy to, and again, this is speculating because not speaking as a white male, speaking as a white female, I don't always relate to the experiences that Wallace is writing, or for that perspective. But I think it's easier perhaps to read from the perspective of somebody who has the perspective that you do. So perhaps he's a slightly forbidding writer to begin with as a woman. Particularly when you hear this kind of, he's so misogynistic and this, that, and the other, and he's not interested in women. But I think that there are a lot of establishment writers, shall we say, of whom that's true. And I think that, I think the landscape with Wallace readership is changing. I hope so.
I think you're right. And it brings me back to a point about the end of that Granola Cruncher story, right? Of this guy going off on a really, like, the most conceivable misogynistic rant you could imagine.
It's the worst.
And there's a story, I remember at one of the Wallace conferences in Illinois, Charles Harris told this story about how one of Wallace's students wrote a story in which he used the word cunt. And Wallace basically failed the kid.
Wow.
Over it and just said, do not ever do that. Get that out of my class. Like, wow. I'm not even going to. And yet, in the end of that story, Wallace uses the word cunt.
He does.
And what I love about the ending of that story is that the end of the story, it literally says, end of story.
Yeah.
so it's like, could you get a more literal bad ending? And he sort of ascribes it to this kind of bad character.
Yeah, it's the last word in insults. I mean, I think it's one of, that is a word that is still, I mean, it's the only sort of unforgivable.
You can't jokingly say. I mean, at least in the U.S., maybe maybe in the U.K. it's a little more jokingly. I don't know.
But I know a lot of people who use it sort of jokingly, and it's. I mean, we're pretty profane here in Ireland. We use profanity as punctuation and for emphasis just all the time. So it's very much a part of the kind of the rhythm of speech here. Or speaking at least for myself. But one thing, to go off on a complete tangent, something that's pretty interesting is cunt is the only word for female genitalia that was not originally pejorative. So it's an enormously powerful word as well, I think. And I could see it kind of being reclaimed to an extent. But I think that's particularly interesting. That's where its power lies, that its origin is not negative.
Well, and it also kind of speaks to this contradictory nature of Wallace, and that he contradicts himself all the time. And that, that's why it's hard to pin him down. Yeah. For every example that I give on either language or a character of saying, well, this sort of backs up a defense of him, you could give a counterpoint that says, no, this actually puts him in this other category.
Sure.
So I find it immensely hard to talk about Wallace and gender without just like tallying up those points of saying like, well, he did this well, he did that bad, he did this well.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I think I think that's a good thing. I think a writer that's easily categorized is a writer you get bored of. At least, I think that's to have a sort of a writer who is, a good feminist writer. If that's the way you're defining a writer, you've lost me already, I think. Right. I mean, so Chimamanda Adichie comes to mind. She is an enormously feminist writer, but it's not the first thing I think about it when I think about her writing. I think about the beauty of her prose and the fact that I'll read a novel of hers in a sitting and not be able to put it down. I don't read them. I don't read her work because it's feminist. Although it is, and she's a wonderful writer.
And like you said, of the Amy Hungerford idea, it kind of misses the point.
Yeah.
And can you speak a little bit about this idea of erasing the other from his work, or the idea of just handling the other in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem that I have with what Hungerford is talking about is it seems to me to miss the point on two levels. First of all, I think that she's very simplistically interpreting Wallace, and I'll talk about that in a second. But secondly, I mean, she's presupposing that we should only read perfect art.
Right.
I mean, like we'd never read anything. You could probably
good luck with that.
Yeah, like maybe we could read a fridge manual. But I don't see that. I mean, I reject her premise, even if she was right about Wallace, I think. But the idea that this idea of erasing the other, it goes back to the question, I think, of solipsism and the kind of the privileging of one's own perspective. And as we've been talking about, I think that it's not necessarily a bad or a badly motivated thing. I don't necessarily think that Wallace assumed his own perspective was the only one that had value. But it's the only one that he's comfortably able to inhabit. And one of the consequences of that can appear to be erasing the other. And it's easy to read that as a power play. And it's easy to read that as a sort of staking claim to the territory of literature. And again, when we talk about gender, when we talk about race, when we talk about, you know, writers from non-traditional backgrounds, that's a conversation that needs to be had. But I don't know that it's as simple as saying writers like Wallace are erasing other people because they don't care about them. I can't believe I'm about to say this. I think it's probably quite hard to be a white male writer.
You're going to get killed for that now.
I know. But in that very particular context, it is a challenge for any writer to inhabit. And this is, I think, what Shriver was pilloried for. I don't think she's totally wrong. I don't think she's right either. But I think the question of inhabiting other minds, regardless of what other minds they are, is an enormously difficult one. And we always run the risk of erasing the other, or of adopting or appropriating an experience that isn't ours to engage with at a deep level. I remember teaching Their Eyes Were Watching God, Zora Neale Hurston, and it's one of the most challenging texts. I love teaching it because there's this chapter in the middle of it. It's the longest chapter in the book about a mule that's died. And it's this whole big, and it's so clearly symbolic language. It's very, very clearly a kind of a folk story that has a meaning, but you're not given the keys. She doesn't give you the keys to the narrative. So you read this whole long story, and as a white writer, or white reader, excuse me, you know, you get to the end of it and you expect it to be explained, and it never is. And it's like Hurston is saying, this is mine. This is my experience. I know what this means. There are people who know what this means, and I am not explaining it to you. I do not owe you that. And I think that's really, really interesting. So the question, it's something I go back and forth on, you know, the question of writing outside one's own experience and engaging with that as a reader, because I think it's a huge challenge. And it's one of the failures in scare quotes that I think is most interesting in Wallace, because there are writers who do this but hide it. There are writers who don't do it at all. Wallace was really obvious about his discomfort with it, and I think it's an interesting failure if it is a failure.
Well, and that's why I think some of the responsibility leans more on the reader rather than the writer, and that it's up to you to go and seek out an authentic transgendered story.
Yeah,
we shouldn't expect everyone who writes to cover, a homosexual person of color and write that authentically. I think that's an incredibly daunting task.
Yeah, and I think it's that expectation is as limiting in its way as refusing to allow a writer beyond the bounds of their own experience. And I mean, it goes back to the question, I think, of what we expect from art at all. I mean, where does art engage with politics? I think that art is always political. I think it has to be. But I don't think that it has to be because it should be. I think it has to be because it is. And I think that we have to take it on its own terms to an extent, which is not to say that we shouldn't represent more minority experiences in art. We absolutely should. And, you know, if I was reading a review in the New Yorker recently of, I think the book is called All That Man Is, and it's James Wood was reviewing it. And I really like his reviews. But somewhere in the review, he said something along the lines of, you know, this tells the story of 9 white male protagonists, and I did just kind of groan, you know. Mainstream publishing is certainly skewed to the white male experience, like most things, I think. And we should certainly that should be broadened out, and that should be the Publishing Academy should be opened more and more and as much as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to force white male writers, for example, to write beyond their experience. It means that we should be seeking authentic stories from non-white male writers, you know? And I think that we have to take art in a sense as it comes. And it's interesting, I think, that we ask this of written art. We ask written art. We ask novels to encompass the whole world. We don't do it so much of visual art, I don't think. Now, I'm not a visual art expert at all, but I don't know that I hear people saying, well, you know, portrait art, they only painted rich people, which is more or less true.
Classist.
And with literature, we've got this VIDA count, right? So we've got VIDA, and with film, they have the Bechdel test.
Yeah.
But you're right, with, certain prizes, there isn't the equivalent awareness, I think, that the diversity is missing.
Yeah.
But I think that is a good sort of structural challenge to all of our artistic systems that needs to happen and will happen. But I do agree with you, and I think that is a separate challenge than how do we evaluate writers in the past tense, really. Like, you can't expect, Hemingway to have your political system like, well, he was a misogynist. Well, it's like,
Hemingway's not someone I would,
years ago.
He's not someone I'd necessarily want to have dinner with. Right. But, I don't, and the question of the artist or the art, I think is more and more fraught as we live in a world that's more and more connected. I mean, I follow Margaret Atwood on Twitter, and she's brilliant. She's just, if you don't follow her on Twitter, you absolutely should, because she's just so good. But you have this, Teju Cole is another writer who's very present on Twitter, very present on social media. Juno Diaz as well. And they very much take their activism onto social media. And I think that it's becoming harder to separate the artist from the product in a way that I'm not sure is positive. And at the same time, surely, I think that it's important to know to an extent who's writing what you're reading, or who's writing what you're reading and where the artists are coming from. So it's a double bind, again, to use that phrase, I think. And I don't know that there's an answer. And I think it's one of the things that I really like about Wallace, actually, that you don't get answers. That these are issues that are raised, and they're just there. You just have to accommodate them.
That's a huge issue with literature in general right now, and that there's a shift towards these personal essays that are thinly veiled fiction. Or there are massive movements like with Elena Ferrante and Knausgaard and Sheila Heti, that is really just a first-person singular point of view as a personal essay. And there's already a lot of backlash towards that. But if the market is moving that way, if that's what readers want, that's probably we're going to see more of that conflation, and that you can't read Elena Ferrante or Knausgaard and not be interested in their personal lives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the whole Ferrante identity thing, because funnily enough, I had no curiosity really about who she was, who she is.
But the books are about who she is.
But the books are about who she is, and I don't think that you get anything more from knowing her name. Or her quote unquote kind of real name than you get from the books. So I think that was an interesting.
It's not interesting. I mean, the fact of who she really is isn't going to reveal any more than she's revealed
in the books. Exactly. But I mean, I think looking back at the kind of the early history of the novel, I think we sort of come full circle in a way, because if you look back to the earliest forms of the novel, they were presented as found documents. They were presented as authentic first-person narratives. And I think that we're moving back towards that, it seems to me, instead of kind of this sort of dispassionate sort of realist fiction that we had for a lot of the 19th and kind of early 20th century. So in a sense, I think we're going back to the beginnings of the novel, and very often they were framed this editor's note saying this was found, beside a lake. I think Manzoni's The Betrothed actually begins with that. I think it was this idea that a parcel of pages, a diary, was found possibly in a lake or a bog, or I can't remember, and it's presented as a true narrative, because the idea was that readers wouldn't accept something that didn't have a sense of authenticity about it. So I think that we're going back to that in a sense. And I remember a few years, I worked in a bookshop while I was at university, and there was a book called The Tenderness of Wolves by Steph Penny. And it was set in Alaska. And there was uproar, I mean, in a very small way, over an interview that Steph Penny did where she said she'd never been to Alaska. And people were phoning in to this show that she was on saying, how dare you write about Alaska? and she was kind of saying, well, did you enjoy the book? Because if you enjoyed the book, then I don't see how we have a problem.
And Saul Bellow had the same thing with Henderson, the Rain King.
Yeah.
He never went to Africa and wrote a book about Africa.
Yeah.
And it's like he was just reviled for that because, not only are you appropriating the experience of Africans, but you never even bothered to research it.
Yeah.
I mean, and he said it's irrelevant.
Yeah.
That if it's good fiction, what does it matter if you've never been to Mars?
Yeah.
And yet you read The Martian.
Yeah. And I think this is it's the crux of a really difficult. I mean, it's a Gordian knot to an extent. There isn't an answer, because at the same time, while I agree with Bellow to an extent, and I agree with Penny to an extent, there is the question of cultural appropriation. There is the question of silencing these voices of forbidding the academy to them, and that does need to be redressed. And I don't know where the balance is.
Well, it's an interesting problem because it's not likely to be solved in a definitive way.
Exactly.
And it does speak to why people read, and that people read science fiction for greatly different reasons than they read a book of advice. And so, like, a book of advice, you're not going to listen to someone who is not an expert. You've got a small child. If you want to read a child rearing expert, it's unlikely you're going to hear some 22-year-old college student and to take their advice and be like, wow, that was really insightful. And I'm going to just, if they don't have the personal experience, most people expect this expertise. And in one point in your book, you talk about how Wallace sort of abrogates that idea of being an expert.
Even when he is an expert. Yeah.
Right? And so you say that's kind of disingenuous.
Yeah.
And that really, does that make him, do you think he was unable then ultimately to write beyond his own perspective?
I think, and I've kind of said this before, I think that he was very conscious of feeling that he couldn't write beyond his own perspective, and whether he could or not, I think his own consciousness of it sort of prescribes it in a way. And perhaps if he'd been less self-conscious, his writing beyond his own experience would have been less clumsy. But because he was so conscious of it all the time and kept drawing attention to it, you have this it's impossible as a reader not to notice it. But I do think some of his nonfiction is disingenuous. I find it charming in some ways. But once you notice it, it becomes very hard to stop noticing it. So one of the places he really does it is in Greatly Exaggerated, in A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, where he keeps saying he aligns himself with his readers in a kind of an us and them scenario, and sort of saying it's hard to know who's going to be interested in this except for hardcore theory weenies, I think is the phrase that he uses. But he was a hardcore theory weenie, and this was in the Harvard Law Review. Like, these are hardcore theory weenies. There's a funny kind of he takes on this. It's part of the voice that he has, I think, in the nonfiction, which is that gorgeous, inclusive, welcoming, listen to your best friend voice that I think certainly I find just endlessly charming. But part of that is that he refuses to assume expertise for anything. Sorry, that was authority and American usage I was talking about just there. Actually, Greatly Exaggerated, he talks about post-structuralism in a pretty knowledgeable way, and he keeps saying, I don't know about this, and yet he very clearly does. And then in Consider the Lobster, I think he talks about a swanky East Coast magazine, and he says they're kind of disingenuous, these magazine people. He's working for the magazine. He is the magazine people, and it establishes what I think is a spurious relationship with the reader. It's a shortcut to empathy, I think. And just once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. And then I wanted everyone else to notice it too. But I at the same time, I find the nonfiction, I love the nonfiction. I just love reading it. But there are places still where he rejects the notion of expertise himself, even when he is an expert. But then at other places, So, for example, Everything and More, you know, he just is not very good at maths, actually. And you know, you're reading it going, those are not the same thing. I think he conflates two paradoxes. He conflates Zeno's paradox with something else. Yeah. I can't remember exactly what it is offhand. And you're sort of reading it going, it is actually a little clumsy here. Yeah. So I'm not totally sure what I'm getting.
And you also called Everything More, you say that he has simple, poor writing in it?
I think he tries to do so much with it. It's such an ambitious text. You know, and I think he tries. You've got these if you're interested sections, and right. So he tries to sort of play to people who don't know a lot about maths but are interested. And I would be one of those. I'm interested in infinity. I think it's such a fascinating concept, yeah. and even from a linguistic philosophy perspective, it's hugely interesting. And so much of what Wittgenstein was talking about emerges from Kantorian set theory, and emerges from what he's talking about with Everything and More. But he's simultaneously trying to write to people who are not very good at maths, and then write to people who do know a lot about maths. So you're invited as a kind of a well-informed reader, which I, by the way, am not when it comes to maths, to skip like 50% of the text. And I just think it's not really, I don't see how it's possible to write both of those texts in one. And I think that Everything and More is a fascinating disaster of a book. I like it. And again, it's this voice that I really want to listen to more, but I find it very frustrating to read. So that's, yeah.
So it's not your second recommendation after the short fiction in particular. Like, is Oblivion your go-to first?
Oblivion is my go-to.
Recommendation to people?
It depends what kind of reader they are, of course.
Yeah.
Oblivion is my go-to, and then I love the nonfiction. I really do. I send people to Get Both Flesh and Not now because it's just such a wonderful collection.
Oh, yeah.
But I have to say, I have such a soft spot for Broom. I just love it. I do. It's like the flaws in Broom, which are many, I think, are just so endearing. I just, it's so clearly a young writer who's got this, he's overflowing with talent and he just loves writing. You can see it so clearly. It's much less tortured, I think, than any of the rest of it. And I find it really kind of infectiously, I find it funny, which says a lot, I think, about my sense of humor.
Like the Norman Bombardini scene, which you talk about a fair bit in your book, with the stakes is out of control funny.
Yeah, he's such a great character. And the names, I know that, I know it's so much Pynchon and Barth, but it's just like Judith Priest, like who thinks of that? That's my favorite. As I said, I read it first anyway, so that was a big part of it, I think.
So it's nostalgic too.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, we have been speaking with Clare Hayes-Brady, lecturer in American literature at University College in Dublin, and we have really enjoyed reading your book, The Unspeakable Failures of David Foster Wallace. Mm-hmm. And do you want to, I was going to ask before we let you go, can you summarize a little bit of the conclusions that you come to at the end of the book?
Oh, it's so long since I read it. Sure.
Well, just hypothetically, how do you think of it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, it's a bit of a clickbaity title. The original title was actually Necessary Failure. And I think that actually encapsulates a lot of what I'm talking about. And I don't want to go too neoliberal on it. I'm not suggesting that failure is a path to success. And I do very much think that the failures that I talk about in the book, which are both failures on Wallace's part as a writer and failures within his writing, I do think that they're failures in the sense that Beckett's writing, I think, is engaged with failure as well. I think it's difficult and it's upsetting and it's frustrating in some ways, but that it's also generative. And I see failure as part of a resistance to closure. That none of the novels end. Short stories, I think, can't end. I think it's part of the form. And there's this desire to keep things going, to keep a conversation going, to never quite let the reader go. Which I find, as a reader, I find very endearing. I come back to it again and again. As a critic, I find it sort of difficult to get to grips with sometimes. But it's one of the things that keeps bringing me back to Wallace, the sense that he wanted to keep talking. He wanted to keep writing and keep going. And to find a way to bridge the gap between himself and the rest of the world. And I think that's, for me, that's the real heart of his work. And heart is exactly what I would call it. That there is an extraordinary amount of love there for the world, for language, for people, in all of their confusion and failure and hopelessness and badness at relationships. And there's a heart, a real beating heart there that I keep going back to. And I
found your conclusion immensely hopeful.
Oh, thank you.
Particularly like the last line, you say that Wallace's resistance to ending helps us to locate a beginning.
Yeah. It was weird trying to write a conclusion to a book that is all about the lack of a conclusion.
Right.
And I think, I see a lot of Beckett, that the fail again, fail better, I think is, and I find I'm somebody who reads Beckett quite hopefully. And I read Wallace hopefully as well. Very much so. So
my fourth grader is fond of telling me that FAIL stands for first attempt in learning.
Yes. Yeah. So, I've come across that on Pinterest before. It's there are a lot of those. They're sort of
use
weird.
That a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Claire, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us
about
your book
and
Wallace in general. Yeah, it's been awesome. Where can people find some of your work? I know recently you wrote a post for Poor York's Summer.
Yeah.
Particularly about the politics of ethnicity and gender.
Yeah.
In Infinite Jest.
I wrote that while I was on holidays. It's not entirely coherent, I think. But
that's okay. It's a blog.
Yeah,
right?
that's what I figured. I recently actually wrote another piece. I sort of mentioned Wallace briefly in it, for the Honest Ulsterman magazine, which is humag.com, their latest issue on motherhood, actually, on the cultural experience of motherhood and that as a journey into language. I'm on maternity leave at the moment, so I haven't been doing a huge amount of sort of normal work, as it were, but I have an essay on George Saunders coming out later this year, cool. I think, on language and politics, which has proven horribly relevant, I think, in sort of recent times. Yeah. There's a lot about the brief and frightening reign of Phil in there, if anyone's read it. So that's coming out. I've got a piece on Jodi Picoult coming out sometime next year,
cool.
on women's writing and that funny dichotomy. I'm also, in a total side interest, publishing a book of essays on burlesque in Ireland. Yeah. That's coming out late next year with Intellect Press. It's just gone. Back to the publishers. What else is going on? I have a piece in Orbit soon enough for their Wallace special issue. I can't remember what I've written, to be perfectly honest.
You sound very prolific. Yeah.
There's some of the stuff anyway.
And you're on Twitter, right?
I am on Twitter at Clare Hayes-Brady. Yeah.
Clare Hayes-Brady,
please come and follow me. It's a lot of it at the moment is about breastfeeding and cake. But sometimes I tweet about important things as well.
That's awesome, Claire. We also want to give a huge thank you to Bloomsbury Academic, who sent us your book gratis.
Yes.
And they've been amazing to Matt and I. They've been sending us so many books lately.
They are brilliant.
Big thanks to Laura Ewan over at Bloomsbury for just being like, hey, what do you guys want? What can I send you? And she's just sending us all this stuff in the mail.
They're just single-handedly establishing a Wallace canon over there. It's amazing.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, and they really are. With Lucas Thompson's book coming out, will be the first in the new Stephen Byrne edited David Foster Wallace series.
I can't wait to read it. I'm so excited.
Yeah, they sent us the electronic version of that.
Jealous.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Must get on that.
Maybe we'll send it to
you. Please do. I'll send you my address. I'm like,
well, we don't have the hard copy yet, but we have the electronic.
Edit this out later, Dave.
Obviously, I would love to read it. I would love to read it.
I'm sure they would send it to you too.
Yeah, I might get in touch with Harris actually.
Yeah. Awesome, Claire. Well, thank you so much again.
Thanks so much, guys.
We can be found online as well. We're Concavity Show on Twitter. And you can email us at concavityshow@gmail.com. As always, we want to thank Robin O'Neill for her art for our podcast and the band Parquet Courts for their song. And I think that covers all the things, Matt. Is that about it?
That's it for now, Dave.
All right. Thanks again, Claire. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys.
Mamacita. Oh
Skype. I hate Skype so much. Maybe I feel like Google Hangouts is maybe more consistent.
Once more with feeling.
There you go.
It's so frustrating. I meant to say at the beginning of the show, like, to just don't pause the Audacity.
Yeah,
just keep it all going.
I left it going.
We've had shows where this happens over and over and over, and Skype problems, and we switch to Google Hangouts.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, hopefully.
So that'll be Plan B in case it goes down.
But it often gives me an excuse to curse, and then Dave puts that at the end of the show as like an Easter egg. So.